Good evening, and welcome to the Price of Power channel. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, as you settle into stillness, as your body relaxes into the comfort of wherever you find yourself, we're drifting toward one of history's quieter miracles, a moment when everything impossible became inevitable. This is the story of Bannockburn, fought on the 23rd and 24th of June in the year 1314, where 7,000 exhausted souls stood against an empire, and where a king who had hidden in caves became a legend carved into stone. As you breathe slowly, let yourself sink into this strange and forgotten moment where mud and blood and spears rewrote the map of Britain. The summer evening in Scotland is long and luminous, the sky holding light until late, painting the hills in shades of grey and green. Imagine standing on those slopes in June 1314, feeling the dampness in the air, that particular Scottish wetness that clings to skin and cloth. The smell of wood smoke drifts from cooking fires. Men speak in hushed voices, checking their weapons, sharpening spear points on whetstones. The metallic rasp of stone on iron is rhythmic, almost meditative. As the night grows quieter around you, you might hear the distant murmur of the Bannockburn, the small stream that will give this battle its name, gurgling over stones in the gathering dusk. The year is 1313, and Scotland is disappearing. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the slow patience of occupation. English garrisons sit in Scottish castles, their flags hanging limp in the Scottish rain. English laws govern Scottish towns. English coins clink in Scottish purses. English voices echo through halls that once belonged to Scottish lords. For 17 years, since 1296, when Edward I, called Longshanks for his unusual height, marched his army across the border and shattered the Scots at Dunbar, Scotland has been learning what it means to be conquered. The conquest was methodical, almost surgical in its efficiency. Edward Longshanks was not a man who left things to chance. After defeating the Scottish army at Dunbar, he marched through Scotland like a tourist, stopping at every significant town and castle, accepting surrenders, installing garrisons, marking his authority on the land. He reached Elgin in the far north, a symbolic gesture that no corner of Scotland was beyond his reach. On his way back south, he stopped at Scone Abbey, where Scottish kings had been crowned for centuries. There, on a stone outcrop called the Moot Hill, sat the Stone of Destiny, a block of red sandstone believed to be the pillow on which Jacob rested his head in the book of Genesis. Scottish kings were crowned sitting upon this stone, linking their authority to biblical antiquity. Edward had the stone removed from its iron frame, loaded onto a cart, and carried south to Westminster Abbey. He had himself crowned upon it, and then he placed it beneath the coronation chair, where it would remain for 700 years. This was not merely theft, it was symbolic amputation. By taking the stone, Edward was declaring that Scottish kingship no longer existed. He removed other sacred objects as well. The Black Rood of St. Margaret, a gold and silver reliquary containing what was believed to be a fragment of the True Cross, was taken from Edinburgh and installed in a church in Durham. The royal regalia of Scotland, crowns and scepters and ceremonial swords, were scattered or melted down. Edward was not interested in ruling Scotland as a separate kingdom under English overlordship. He wanted Scotland to cease existing as a concept. But as you rest tonight, as your thoughts begin to drift, consider this quiet truth that empires forget. A country is not its stones, it is not its relics, it is not its regalia. It is the people who refuse to forget their names. By 1313, most of Scotland has been reclaimed from English control, not through grand battles fought in open fields with banners flying and trumpets sounding, but through guerrilla war, ambush, siege, and attrition. The man leading this slow resurrection is Robert Bruce, crowned King of Scots in 1306, in a ceremony so desperate, so makeshift, that some chroniclers barely acknowledge it as legitimate. Robert Bruce's path to the throne was neither straight nor clean. He was born in 1274 into a powerful Norman-Scottish family that had lands in both Scotland and England. His grandfather had been one of the claimants to the Scottish throne during the Great Cause, the succession crisis that gave Edward Longshanks the excuse to intervene in Scottish affairs in the first place. Bruce grew up speaking multiple languages. He spoke the Anglo-Norman French of the nobility, the language of court and law. He spoke the Scots language, the Germanic tongue of the lowlands. He spoke Gaelic, the language of his mother's family and the Western Highlands. He could read and write Latin, the language of the church and of scholarship. He was educated in chivalry, in the romances of Charlemagne and Arthur, in the codes of honor that governed knightly conduct. He was, by all accounts, a cultured man, well-read, musically inclined, and deeply religious. He was also pragmatic to the point of ruthlessness. In 1306, frustrated by years of political maneuvering and tired of watching Scotland bleed under English occupation, Bruce made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He arranged a meeting with John Comyn, his rival for the Scottish throne, in the chapel of Greyfriars Monastery in Dumfries. What exactly happened in that chapel is disputed. Some accounts say they argued about a plan to overthrow the English, and Comyn threatened to betray Bruce to Edward. Other accounts suggest Bruce simply decided that Comyn had to die if Bruce was ever to be king. What is certain is that Bruce drew a dagger and stabbed Comyn before the high altar, one of the most sacred places in Christendom. Comyn did not die immediately. Bruce fled the chapel, leaving Comyn bleeding on the floor. When Bruce's companions asked if Comyn was dead, Bruce admitted he was not certain. One of his men, Roger Kirkpatrick, supposedly said, "I'll make sure," and returned to the chapel with another knight. They finished what Bruce had started, killing Comyn where he lay. The murder was a catastrophe in multiple dimensions. It was sacrilege committed in a church. It was treason against the feudal order. It was a violation of the chivalric code that Bruce himself had been raised to uphold. The Pope excommunicated Bruce. The English king declared him an outlaw. Many Scottish nobles, particularly Comyn's relatives and allies, swore to see Bruce dead. But Bruce did not flee. Instead, 6 weeks later, he rode to Scone Abbey and had himself crowned King of Scots in a ceremony that was improvised and desperate. The traditional crown was in English hands, so a simple circlet of gold was used. The stone of destiny was gone, so Bruce sat on whatever was available. The earls who traditionally performed the coronation were absent or hostile, so Bruce's supporters filled the roles. One of the key participants was Isabella, Countess of Buchan, who claimed the hereditary right to crown the king as a representative of the Macduff family. Her participation was an act of extraordinary courage, and she would pay for it. When the English captured her later that year, Edward Longshanks had her imprisoned in a cage, a wooden and iron cell suspended from the walls of Berwick Castle, exposed to the elements and public view for 4 years. Bruce's early reign was a disaster. Within months of his coronation, he suffered catastrophic defeats. At the Battle of Methven in June 1306, he was surprised by an English force, and his army was scattered. He fled into the hills with a handful of survivors, pursued by English soldiers and Scottish enemies alike. 3 of his brothers were captured and executed. His wife, daughter, and sisters were taken prisoner and held in harsh captivity. By autumn of 1306, Robert Bruce was a king with no kingdom, a fugitive hiding in caves and remote islands, sustained only by a few loyal companions. It is during this period that the legend of the spider enters the story. The tale is probably apocryphal, first recorded in writing by Sir Walter Scott in the early 1800s, centuries after the events. But like many legends, it captures something true about the psychological journey Bruce underwent. According to the story, Bruce was hiding in a cave, possibly on the island of Rathlin off the northern coast of Ireland, or perhaps in a cave near Kirkpatrick Fleming in Dumfriesshire, or on the Isle of Arran in the Firth of Clyde. Multiple locations claim the honor, and the exact site does not matter. What matters is the image. A man at his absolute lowest point, excommunicated by the church, hunted by the most powerful king in Europe, his family imprisoned or dead, sitting alone in the darkness of a cave, contemplating whether to give up and flee to France or Norway and live out his days in exile. As he sat there, according to the legend, he watched a spider attempting to spin a web. The spider tried to swing a strand of silk from one side of the cave to another, anchoring its web. It failed. It tried again. It failed again. Again and again, the spider attempted to connect the web, and each time it fell. Bruce, identifying with the spider's struggle, began to count the failures. 6 times the spider failed. Bruce had fought 6 battles against the English and lost them all. If the spider failed on the 7th attempt, Bruce decided, he would accept it as a sign from God that his cause was hopeless. But the spider succeeded. On the 7th try, the strand of silk caught, and the web began to take shape. Bruce took this as his sign. He would try once more. Whether this story is historically accurate or a later invention designed to illustrate Bruce's perseverance does not diminish its power as narrative. What is historically certain is that Bruce did return from exile in early 1307. He did not return with an army. He returned with a guerrilla war. He avoided open battle, focusing instead on ambushes, night raids, and hit-and-run tactics. He burned English supply depots. He assassinated isolated English soldiers. He besieged small castles, capturing them not through assault, but through patience, starving out the garrisons. He executed Scottish nobles who sided with the English, confiscating their lands and redistributing them to his supporters. It was brutal, unglamorous warfare, the kind that does not feature in chivalric romances. But it worked. Slowly, castle by castle, town by town, Bruce reclaimed Scotland. In 1307, he achieved his first significant open-field victory at the Battle of Loudon Hill, using terrain and defensive tactics to defeat a larger English force. The victory was modest in scale, but enormous in psychological impact. It proved that Bruce could win, that the English were not invincible. More importantly, it demonstrated that Bruce had learned from his previous defeats. At Loudon Hill, he used a narrow battlefield flanked by marshes, limiting the English cavalry's ability to maneuver. He deployed his infantry in tight formations behind defensive ditches, forcing the English knights to charge into a prepared position. The English broke against his lines and retreated. It was a blueprint for Bannockburn. Over the next 7 years, Bruce's power grew. He eliminated his Scottish rivals, either through battle or negotiation. He cultivated alliances with Highland clans, particularly the MacDonalds of the Isles, whose naval power controlled the western seaboard. He won the support of the Scottish Church despite his excommunication because the Church saw him as the only viable alternative to English domination. By 1313, only 2 major fortresses in Scotland remained under English control: Berwick on the border and Stirling Castle. Stirling Castle is more than a fortress. It sits atop a volcanic crag, a natural stronghold rising abruptly from the plain, with sheer cliffs on 3 sides and only one approach that could be defended by a handful of men. The castle commands the lowest crossing point of the River Forth, the river that separates the lowlands from the highlands. Control Stirling and you control the gateway to the north. Lose Stirling and you lose Scotland. Edward Longshanks had understood this, which is why he invested heavily in fortifying the castle after capturing it in 1298. In 1313, Bruce's younger brother, Edward Bruce, laid siege to Stirling. The garrison commander was Sir Philip Mowbray, a Scottish knight loyal to England. Mowbray was a practical man, and he understood that the siege was unsustainable, his supplies were limited, and no relief seemed forthcoming. But Mowbray was also shrewd. Instead of surrendering immediately, he negotiated a peculiar agreement with Edward Bruce. Mowbray promised that if no English relief force arrived by Midsummer's Day, the 24th of June 1314, he would surrender the castle without resistance. The agreement was formalized, sealed with oaths, and witnessed by both sides. This agreement was both brilliant and dangerous for Bruce. It gave him a deadline, a specific date by which Stirling would fall into his hands. But it also gave Edward II, King of England, a clear casus belli, a reason to mobilize a massive army. Edward could not ignore the challenge. To allow Stirling to fall without an attempt at relief would be seen as weakness, and Edward's position in England was already precarious. The barons who had executed his favorite Piers Gaveston in 1312 were watching for any sign that Edward lacked the will or ability to govern. The loss of Stirling would be politically catastrophic. So in the spring of 1314, Edward issued summons across England, Wales, and Ireland. He called for the largest army England had ever sent into Scotland. The mobilization was extraordinary in scale. Knights and men-at-arms, the armored cavalry that formed the core of medieval armies, were summoned from their estates. Each knight was expected to bring his retinue, squires and servants, and additional men-at-arms. Foot soldiers were conscripted from villages and towns, some willingly, many reluctantly. The king's household provided a corps of professional soldiers, men who made their living in war. From Wales came archers, the famed longbowmen who had proven their worth in campaigns in France and Scotland. From Ireland came additional infantry, men accustomed to the brutal, small-scale warfare of the Irish countryside. The numbers are disputed by historians, as medieval chroniclers routinely exaggerated the size of armies, particularly enemy armies, to make victories seem more impressive. English sources suggest Edward assembled somewhere between 13,000 and 16,000 infantry, along with approximately 2,000 heavy cavalry. Some Scottish chroniclers, eager to emphasize the scale of the victory, claimed the English had 25,000 men or more. Modern historians, examining logistical records and supply requisitions, generally settle on a figure of around 15,000 to 18,000 total combatants, with perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 of those being mounted knights and men-at-arms. Even at the lower estimates, this was an overwhelming force. Medieval armies were small by modern standards, but they were expensive to maintain and difficult to supply. An army of 15,000 men required hundreds of tons of food each day, thousands of horses that needed fodder, blacksmiths to repair weapons and armor, carts to carry supplies, and a command structure to coordinate movement and deployment. Edward spared no expense. The royal treasury was opened, contracts were signed with merchants to provide grain, salted meat, wine, ale. Horses were purchased or requisitioned. Armor was commissioned from workshops in London and other cities. The logistical preparation took months. The army assembled at Berwick in late May 1314. From there, they marched north along the coastal road, a route that allowed supply ships to follow them and provide additional provisions. Edward drove the army hard, perhaps too hard. The king was eager to reach Stirling before the deadline, and he pushed his men to cover over 70 miles in a single week. For infantry marching on foot, carrying packs and weapons, in the heat of early summer, this was punishing. Horses went lame, men collapsed from exhaustion. Discipline began to fray. Some soldiers deserted, slipping away during the night marches. The English army arrived in the vicinity of Stirling on the evening of the 22nd of June, 2 days before Mowbray's deadline. They were exhausted, hungry, and demoralized, but they were still the largest army in Britain, and they expected to sweep the Scottish forces aside. Edward held a council of war that evening, consulting with his commanders. Some urged caution, suggesting they rest the men for a day or two before engaging the Scots. Others, more aggressive, argued that delay would give Bruce time to retreat or fortify his position further. Edward, eager to prove himself, sided with the aggressive faction. They would attack at dawn. Robert Bruce, camped a few miles south of Stirling in an area known as the New Park, a royal hunting preserve, had spent weeks preparing for this moment. He had chosen his ground with extraordinary care. The New Park was densely wooded, with thick stands of oak and ash providing cover for his troops and limiting the ability of English cavalry to deploy in formation. To the south of the forest was a small stream called the Bannockburn, which carved a shallow valley through the landscape. The ground around the burn was marshy in places, soft and treacherous for horses. To the east, the land sloped down toward a tidal bog known as the Carse, a wide flat expanse that flooded at high tide. Bruce positioned his men at the edge of the forest, where the trees protected his flanks and the difficult terrain funneled any English advance into narrow approaches. But Bruce's most ingenious preparation was invisible. In the days before the English arrived, Bruce's soldiers dug pits across the approaches to the Scottish position. These pits were approximately 3 feet deep and 3 feet wide, just large enough to break a horse's leg if it stepped into one. At the bottom of each pit, they planted sharpened wooden stakes angled upward. Then they covered the pits with woven branches, turf, and grass, disguising them so they looked like solid ground. The pits were scattered irregularly, making it impossible for cavalry to predict where they might fall. Chronicles describe these traps as calthrops for the feet of horses, a reference to the 4-spiked metal devices used to maim cavalry mounts. The pits served the same purpose, and they were scattered across the main road from Falkirk, the route the English would naturally use to approach the Scottish lines. Bruce divided his army into 4 divisions, or battles as they were called in medieval terminology. Each division was organized into schiltrons, tight formations of spearmen standing shoulder to shoulder. The schiltron was not a Scottish invention. Similar formations had been used by the Flemish at the Battle of Courtrai in 1302, where Flemish pikemen had defeated French knights by standing firm behind defensive obstacles. The Greeks had used the phalanx, a comparable formation, in ancient times. But Bruce refined the schiltron into something more flexible and aggressive. The traditional schiltron, as used by William Wallace at the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, was circular and defensive. The spearmen formed a ring, with spears pointing outward like the spines of a hedgehog. It was effective against cavalry charges, as horses would not willingly impale themselves on a wall of spears. But it was static. The men in a circular schiltron could not advance without breaking formation, and once they broke formation, they were vulnerable. At Falkirk, Wallace's schiltrons held against cavalry charges, but English archers simply stood at a distance and shot them to pieces. The schiltrons could not move to engage the archers, and they had no protection against missile fire. Bruce adapted the formation. Instead of circular schiltrons, he trained his men to form rectangular blocks. The front rows knelt, bracing the butts of their spears against the ground. The rows behind stood, their spears angled forward over the heads of the men in front. This created multiple layers of spear points, a hedge of iron that was almost impenetrable. More importantly, Bruce trained his men to advance in formation. This required extraordinary discipline. Each man had to maintain his position relative to the men around him, stepping forward in unison, keeping the lines tight. If one man fell or stumbled, the men beside him had to close the gap immediately. A single break in the line could allow cavalry to burst through and destroy the formation from within. Training men to fight in a schiltron was difficult. Most of Bruce's soldiers were not professional warriors. They were farmers, laborers, craftsmen, men who had been called up by their lords or who volunteered out of loyalty to Bruce. They had little experience with organized warfare. Bruce drilled them relentlessly, teaching them to stand firm under pressure, to trust the men beside them, to ignore the instinct to flee when cavalry charged. He used veterans to anchor the formations, placing experienced soldiers at key points to steady the younger men. He also appealed to their sense of identity. These men were fighting for their homes, their families, their right to live under Scottish law rather than English occupation. That sense of purpose was a weapon in itself. Bruce commanded one division personally. His brother, Edward Bruce, commanded another. Edward was impetuous and aggressive, a stark contrast to Robert's calculated caution, but he was also fearless and inspired loyalty. Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, Bruce's nephew, commanded the 3rd Division. Randolph was one of the most capable military leaders in Scotland, a man who combined tactical intelligence with personal bravery. The 4th Division was jointly commanded by Sir James Douglas and Walter the Steward. Douglas was Bruce's most trusted lieutenant, a man whose name would become synonymous with terror in northern England. He earned the nickname Black Douglas from the English, who told their children that if they misbehaved, the Black Douglas would come for them in the night. Walter the Steward was younger, less experienced, but connected to powerful families and destined to found the Stuart dynasty that would eventually rule Scotland and England. Bruce also had the support of Angus Og MacDonald, Lord of the Isles, who brought warriors from the Western Highlands and Islands. Among these were Galaglas, elite mercenaries of mixed Norse and Irish ancestry, heavily armored shock troops who fought with two-handed axes and were renowned for their ferocity. Bruce positioned the Galaglas in his own schiltron, giving them the place of honor at his side. This was both a tactical decision and a political one. By honoring the MacDonalds in this way, Bruce reinforced the alliance that secured his western flank and controlled the sea lanes to Ireland. Bruce's total force numbered between 7,000 and 10,000 men, though the higher estimate likely includes camp followers, servants, and other non-combatants. His core fighting strength was probably closer to 7,000. Of these, perhaps 500 were mounted, light cavalry on small, agile horses, suitable for reconnaissance and harassment, but utterly outmatched in a direct clash with English knights. The vast majority of Bruce's army were infantry, most armed with 12-foot spears, some carrying axes, daggers, or swords. They had shields, simple wooden rounds covered with leather, and some wore quilted padded jackets called gambesons that provided limited protection against cuts and blows. Few had metal armor, they could not afford it. On the evening of the 22nd of June, the English army camped south of the Bannockburn. They were crammed into the narrow space between the stream and the marshes, unable to deploy properly. Men jostled for space, horses stamped and whinnied, agitated by the crowding. The smell of thousands of men and animals packed into a confined area was overwhelming, sweat and horse dung and the smoke of cooking fires. Some soldiers managed to sleep, exhausted from the march. Others sat awake, nervous, checking their equipment over and over, sharpening swords that were already sharp, adjusting straps on armor that did not need adjusting. In the Scottish camp, men knelt for absolution. Priests moved through the lines, hearing confessions, offering blessings, reminding the soldiers that they fought a just war, that God favored their cause. Bruce walked among his men, speaking quietly, offering encouragement, joking with veterans, reassuring the inexperienced. He reminded them of what they were fighting for, not just political independence, but their families, their land, their right to live free from occupation. He told them that tomorrow they would face the largest army England had ever sent into Scotland. He told them that the English expected them to run. He told them that they would not run. They would stand, and they would win. And then, as the night deepened, something unexpected happened. A Scottish knight named Sir Alexander Seton, who had been serving in Edward's army, rode into Bruce's camp. Seton was a minor nobleman, a man with lands in both Scotland and England, whose loyalties had been divided. But seeing the English army up close, seeing the exhaustion and low morale, seeing the confusion and poor leadership, Seton made a choice. He defected. He told Bruce that the English were vulnerable, that their morale was brittle, that their commanders were arguing among themselves, that Edward himself seemed indecisive and overwhelmed. Seton urged Bruce to attack immediately before the English could rest and reorganize. He insisted that if Bruce struck now, he could win. Bruce listened. And in that moment, sitting in his tent with the flicker of candles casting shadows on the walls, Robert Bruce made the decision that would define his legacy. He would not wait. He would not retreat into the hills and wage another guerrilla campaign. He would fight a pitched battle on ground of his choosing with an army half the size of the enemy's, betting everything on his tactics, his men's discipline, and his own nerve. It was an enormous gamble. If he lost, the Scottish independence movement would collapse. His family would be executed. Scotland would be absorbed into England permanently. But if he won, he would change history. The first day of battle, the 23rd of June, began not with trumpets or formal challenges, but with a single knight's arrogance and a king's audacity. Early in the morning, as the Scottish army took up its positions near the New Park, a vanguard of English knights advanced along the main road, probing the Scottish lines, testing the defences. At the head of this column rode Sir Henry de Bohun, nephew of the Earl of Hereford, a young man of considerable reputation and burning ambition. He was dressed in full armour, mounted on a massive warhorse, the kind of Flemish destrier bred specifically for war, standing over 16 hands tall and weighing more than a ton. De Bohun's lance was levelled, and his coat of arms was displayed prominently on his shield and surcoat. As de Bohun rode forward, scanning the Scottish lines for a target, he saw, across the field perhaps 50 yards away, a figure mounted on a much smaller horse. The man wore simple clothing, just a leather jerkin and a mail hauberk, but around his helmet was a distinctive golden crown. It was Robert Bruce, King of Scots, riding in front of his army, inspecting his troops, checking their positions, offering last words of encouragement. He was riding alone, without bodyguards, on a small palfrey, a riding horse rather than a war horse, and he carried only a battle axe slung across his saddle. De Bohun must have thought he was dreaming. Here was the King of Scots, the man whose head would buy de Bohun fame and fortune beyond measure, riding alone and vulnerable. If de Bohun could kill Bruce, the entire Scottish army would collapse. The rebellion would be over. De Bohun would be immortalized. Without hesitation, de Bohun spurred his horse and charged. The ground shook under the weight of the warhorse at full gallop. The lance was levelled, aimed directly at Bruce's chest. Thousands of men on both sides stopped what they were doing. Scottish soldiers held their breath. English knights watched, confident that their champion would skewer the Scottish king like a rabbit. But Robert Bruce did not flee. He did not call for help. He simply waited, sitting calmly on his small horse, watching de Bohun thunder toward him. At the last possible second, as the lance was almost upon him, Bruce twisted his horse to the left. The lance passed harmlessly through the space where Bruce had been a heartbeat before. As de Bohun's momentum carried him past, Bruce stood high in his stirrups, raised his battle axe, and brought it down with all his strength on de Bohun's helmeted head. The impact was catastrophic. The axe blade, sharpened to a razor edge and swung with the full force of Bruce's arms and shoulders, struck the top of de Bohun's great helm, the heavy bucket-shaped helmet that protected the head and face. The blade sheared through the steel, through the padding beneath, through the skull, and into the brain. De Bohun was dead before he hit the ground. His horse, panicked, bolted away, dragging the corpse behind it for several yards before the body came loose and lay still in the grass. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then the Scottish army erupted in cheers, a roar of triumph that echoed across the valley. Men beat their shields with their spears, shouting Bruce's name, crying out in exultation. The English vanguard, stunned and horrified, pulled back. Bruce rode slowly back to his lines, and only then did his commanders see that his axe handle had snapped from the force of the blow. Bruce looked down at the broken weapon, then looked up at his men and said quietly, "I have broken my good axe." His commanders scolded him, asking how he could have been so reckless, risking his life and the fate of Scotland for a moment of personal combat. Bruce listened patiently, then smiled and said nothing. He did not need to explain. Every man in the army had seen what happened. They had seen their king face an enemy knight alone and kill him with a single blow. They had seen courage that bordered on insanity, and they had seen that the English could be beaten. Morale, which had been good, became unshakable. The men knew that tomorrow, when the real battle came, they would follow Robert Bruce into hell if he asked. The rest of the first day was a series of skirmishes and probing attacks. Thomas Randolph's division repelled a cavalry charge near Stirling Castle, a furious melee that ended with the English retreating in disorder. Another English probe was driven back with losses. By evening, the English had made no progress toward relieving Stirling, and they had suffered casualties without inflicting significant damage on the Scots. Edward's commanders urged him to rest the army, to spend the night regrouping and planning a coordinated assault. Edward, frustrated and humiliated by the day's failures, reluctantly agreed, but the damage was done. The initiative had shifted to Bruce. That night, the atmosphere in the two camps could not have been more different. The Scots were jubilant, confident, ready to fight. Priests moved among them, offering final blessings. Men checked their weapons one last time, made their peace with God, and prepared to stand in the line tomorrow. Bruce moved through the camp, stopping to speak with individuals, thanking them for their courage, reminding them that tomorrow would decide Scotland's fate. He did not sleep much, if at all. He spent the night with his commanders, finalizing the plan for the morning. The English camp, by contrast, was chaos. Men argued over rations. Horses were still crowded together, many without proper feed. The commanders could not agree on strategy. Some wanted to withdraw and regroup at a more favorable position. Others insisted they had to attack or risk losing all credibility. Edward, caught between these factions, dithered. He could not make a clear decision. Worse, the army was positioned badly. They were still crammed into the narrow space between the burn and the marshes, unable to deploy their full strength. Cavalry units were scattered and disorganized. Infantry were mixed in with cavalry, making coordinated movement almost impossible. Some soldiers, sensing disaster, deserted during the night, slipping away toward the border. As dawn broke on the 24th of June, a grey morning with mist hanging in the valleys, the Scottish army prepared to do something unprecedented. Instead of waiting in their defensive positions for the English to attack, they advanced. Bruce ordered his 4 divisions to move forward, marching down from the new park toward the English lines. The schiltrons began to advance, moving slowly, deliberately, spears leveled, maintaining perfect formation. English chroniclers described the sight with a mixture of awe and terror. They wrote that the Scots came forward like a thick hedge, like a forest of spears, an impenetrable wall of iron moving steadily downhill. The English commanders were stunned. Foot soldiers did not attack cavalry. Foot soldiers defended. They held ground. They ran away. They did not march toward armored knights as if they were invincible. But here were thousands of Scottish spearmen advancing in perfect order, and the English had no idea how to respond. Edward ordered his cavalry to charge, to break the schiltrons before they could reach the English lines. But the ground betrayed him. The hidden pits that Bruce had prepared were scattered across the path the English cavalry had to take. As the knights spurred their horses forward, the mounts began to fall, legs snapping as they plunged into the disguised holes, riders thrown from their saddles, landing on the sharpened stakes, or simply hitting the ground hard enough to be stunned or killed. Those knights who avoided the pits found themselves funneled into narrow lanes where the Scottish spears waited. The schiltrons did not break. They did not waver. The front ranks knelt, bracing their spears, creating a wall of points that horses would not charge. The ranks behind thrust their spears forward, creating multiple layers of death. Knights who tried to force their way through were impaled. Horses screamed and reared, throwing their riders. The charge collapsed into a milling chaos of panicked animals and dismounted men trying desperately to retreat. The English tried again. Another cavalry charge was ordered, this time directed at a different section of the Scottish line. The result was the same. The pits broke the momentum of the charge. The schiltrons held. The English knights were slaughtered. The ground was littered with dead and dying horses, their armored bodies lying in grotesque tangles, legs broken, bellies opened. The smell of blood and excrement filled the air. The screams of wounded animals mingled with the shouts of men and the clash of steel on steel. Edward ordered his archers forward, hoping to do to Bruce what English archers had done to Wallace at Falkirk. But Bruce had prepared for this as well. As soon as the Welsh longbowmen began to deploy, Bruce sent his light cavalry under Sir Robert Keith to attack them. The archers, positioned on the flank without infantry support, were vulnerable. Keith's horsemen charged into them, scattering them before they could loose more than a few volleys. Archers without protection were easy targets for cavalry. They were cut down or driven off the field, and the English lost their most effective counter to massed infantry. Now the battle became a slow, grinding advance. The Scottish schiltrons pushed forward, step by methodical step, their spears thrusting at any English soldier within reach. The English infantry tried to form defensive lines, but they were disorganized and demoralized. The cavalry was in shambles, unable to reform or mount effective counterattacks. The English were being compressed into an ever-shrinking space, pushed back toward the Bannockburn. Men began to panic. In the thick of the fighting, the Earl of Gloucester, Gilbert de Clare, one of the most powerful nobles in England and a close ally of Edward, led a desperate charge against Edward Bruce's division. Gloucester was young, brave, and eager to prove himself. He had argued with Edward the night before, and some historians suggest he charged recklessly to redeem his honor. He rode directly into the wall of spears, and he and his knights were destroyed almost instantly. Gloucester was pulled from his horse and killed on the spot. His death sent shockwaves through the English army. If Gloucester could be killed, if a man of his rank and power could be cut down by common soldiers with spears, then no one was safe. Other prominent English knights fell. Sir Robert Clifford, a veteran commander who had fought at Stirling Bridge and Falkirk, was killed. Payne Tiptoft, William Marshall, men whose names were known across England, died in the crush. The battlefield was a nightmare of close-quarters combat, men hacking at each other with swords and axes, stabbing with daggers, grappling in the mud. The Scots were relentless, pressing forward, giving no quarter. The English, hemmed in on all sides, began to break. And then, at the height of the battle, as the English were teetering on the edge of collapse, something appeared that tipped the balance completely. From the woods behind the Scottish lines, a new force emerged. Thousands of figures, shouting and waving banners and sheets, surged forward. The English, already demoralized, saw what they believed was a massive Scottish reinforcement. In reality, these were the camp followers, the cooks, servants, grooms, and other non-combatants who had been waiting in the rear. Bruce, seeing the English wavering, had ordered them forward, knowing that the English would not realize they were unarmed. The psychological impact was devastating. The sight of what appeared to be fresh troops broke the English completely. Panic spread like wildfire. Soldiers threw down their weapons and ran. The retreat became a rout. Men scrambled toward the Bannockburn, trying to cross the stream and escape, but the banks were steep and muddy, and the water was deeper than it appeared. Men in heavy armor plunged into the stream and sank, dragged down by the weight of their equipment. Others were pushed into the water by the press of men behind them and drowned in the crush. The stream became clogged with bodies. Chronicles describe soldiers walking across the Bannockburn on the corpses of the drowned, the water running red with blood. Edward II, watching from a distance, saw his army disintegrate. His bodyguards seized his horse's bridle and dragged him away from the battlefield. One of his companions, Sir Giles d'Argenton, a knight of legendary reputation who had fought in the Crusades, escorted Edward to safety and then turned back. D'Argenton declared that he would not be remembered as the man who fled while his comrades fought. He charged alone into the Scottish lines, a last gesture of chivalric honor, and was cut down within moments. His death symbolized the futility of individual courage against disciplined mass infantry. Edward rode desperately for Stirling Castle, pursued by Scottish soldiers. He barely escaped capture, his horse killed under him, his shield-bearer brought down and taken prisoner. He reached the gates of Stirling Castle, only to be turned away by Sir Philip Mowbray. Mowbray, the garrison commander, told Edward bluntly that the castle was about to surrender under the terms of the agreement with Edward Bruce, and if Edward took refuge inside, he would inevitably be captured when the Scots took the castle. Edward, with no other option, turned away and rode east, skirting the edge of the battlefield. Sir James Douglas, one of Bruce's most effective commanders, pursued Edward with a small band of horsemen. Douglas had fewer than 60 men, hastily gathered during the rout. As he rode through the Torwood, a forest south of Stirling, he encountered Sir Lawrence Abernethy, a Scottish knight who had been riding to join the English. Abernethy, seeing the situation, immediately changed sides and joined Douglas in the pursuit. Together, they chased Edward across 60 miles of Scottish countryside. The chase was relentless. Edward and his bodyguards rode so hard that, as the chronicler John Barber wrote, there was not even leisure to make water, meaning they did not stop even to relieve themselves. Douglas pressed them constantly, coming close enough to shout insults at the fleeing king, but unable to close the distance enough to engage. Edward's bodyguard, though small, fought with desperate determination, knowing that if they failed, their king would be captured. They reached Dunbar Castle on the coast after covering 60 miles in a single day of hard riding. At Dunbar, Edward was received by Patrick, Earl of Dunbar, a Scottish nobleman who had remained loyal to England throughout the wars. Dunbar offered Edward the castle, removing his own family to make room for the king. But Dunbar, though loyal, was also realistic. He knew that Bannockburn had been a catastrophe, and he knew that holding Dunbar Castle with Edward inside would invite a Scottish siege that the castle could not withstand. Dunbar urged Edward to leave Scotland immediately. He arranged for a ship, and Edward, along with a few companions, sailed from Dunbar to Berwick, then continued south to York. Behind him, Scotland was lost. The English army, or what remained of it, scattered in all directions. Some soldiers fled east toward the border, others fled south, pursued by Scottish forces and harassed by Scottish civilians. The roads were clogged with fugitives, many of them wounded, all of them terrified. Local populations, Scottish villagers and farmers who had suffered under English occupation, fell upon the fleeing soldiers with pitchforks, axes, knives, clubs, anything that could kill. It was not a battle, it was a massacre. Many English soldiers who survived the battle itself died during the retreat, cut down by Scottish civilians seeking revenge for years of oppression. The only English unit that maintained any cohesion was a force of Welsh spearmen commanded by Sir Maurice de Berkeley. These men stayed together, marching in formation, ready to fight off any pursuit. They covered the 90 miles to Carlisle and reached safety. But they were the exception. Most of the English army simply disintegrated. Historians estimate that only about a third of the English infantry made it back to England alive. Thousands were killed, thousands more were captured and held for ransom. The death toll was staggering. The battlefield itself was a scene of unimaginable carnage. Bodies lay everywhere, English knights in their expensive armor lying beside common soldiers, horses piled in heaps where they had fallen, the ground churned into mud mixed with blood. The stream was choked with corpses. The air was thick with the smell of death. For days after the battle, Scottish soldiers moved through the field, stripping armor and weapons from the dead, collecting valuables, identifying prisoners who could be ransomed. It was grim, brutal work. The Scottish casualties were much lighter, though not insignificant. Barber's Chronicle claims that only 2 Scottish knights were killed, but this is almost certainly an underestimate designed to emphasize the scale of the victory. Modern historians suggest that several hundred Scottish infantry died, along with a number of knights and nobles. The difference in casualties reflects the nature of the battle. The Scots fought from a defensive position, with prepared obstacles and superior tactics. The English attacked across difficult ground into prepared positions and were destroyed piecemeal. In the immediate aftermath, the spoils were distributed. The Scottish army captured the entire English baggage train, a treasure beyond imagining for men who had spent years fighting a guerrilla war with limited resources. Tents, pavilions, armor, weapons, horses, food, wine, gold, silver, everything the English had brought with them was taken. 200 pairs of silver spurs, symbols of knighthood, were recovered from the battlefield. The English treasury chest, containing thousands of pounds in coin intended to pay the troops, was captured intact. Bruce distributed the loot generously, rewarding his commanders and compensating his soldiers. For many of these men, the plunder from Bannockburn represented more wealth than they had ever seen. But Bruce's greatest prize was not material, it was human. The Earl of Hereford, Edward's brother-in-law, was captured along with numerous other high-ranking nobles. Bruce used these prisoners as bargaining chips, negotiating their ransom for Scottish prisoners held in England. The most important exchange was for Bruce's wife, Elizabeth de Burgh, his daughter Marjorie, his sisters Christina and Mary, and Robert Wishart, the Bishop of Glasgow. These women and the bishop had been held prisoner in England for 8 years, some of them confined in cages suspended from castle walls, exposed to public view and the elements as punishment for supporting Bruce. Their release was a personal triumph for Bruce, as meaningful to him as the military victory. Stirling Castle surrendered, and Bruce ordered it dismantled. The castle was torn down stone by stone, so that it could never again be used as an English stronghold against Scotland. Other English garrisons fell in quick succession. Bothwell Castle, where a group of English nobles had taken refuge, was surrendered by the constable, Sir Walter Fitz-Gilbert, who pragmatically decided to switch sides. Dunbar Castle was captured. Jedburgh fell. By 1315, only Berwick remained in English hands, and even that would eventually be retaken. Bannockburn did not end the war. The conflict between England and Scotland would continue in various forms for another 14 years. Edward II, though humiliated, did not give up his claim to overlordship of Scotland. He launched raids and campaigns, though none succeeded in reversing Bruce's gains. Scotland, emboldened by the victory, went on the offensive. Scottish forces raided northern England repeatedly, burning towns, capturing castles, extracting tribute from English nobles who paid protection money to avoid being attacked. The raids reached as far south as Yorkshire, and on one occasion, Scottish troops threatened York itself. The English were forced to build fortifications around their northern towns, turning the border into a militarized zone. In 1315, Bruce's brother, Edward Bruce, led an ambitious expedition to Ireland, attempting to open a second front against England and to spread the war beyond Scotland. Edward Bruce declared himself High King of Ireland, challenging English authority in that country as well. The Irish campaign was initially successful, with several Irish clans joining Bruce's forces, but the campaign dragged on, and the initial momentum was lost. In 1318, Edward Bruce was killed at the Battle of Faughart, defeated by an English army led by Edmund Butler, the Irish justiciar. Edward Bruce's severed head was sent back to Edward II as a trophy, a grim reversal of Scottish fortunes in Ireland. Meanwhile, in England, Edward's political situation deteriorated. The barons who had been restive before Bannockburn now openly challenged the king's authority. Edward's new favourite, Hugh Despenser, became as hated as Piers Gaveston had been. In 1326, Edward's wife, Isabella of France, returned from a diplomatic mission to France, accompanied by Roger Mortimer, an exiled English baron. Together, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England with a mercenary army, deposing Edward in favour of his teenage son, Edward III. Edward II was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, and in September 1327 he was murdered, reportedly by having a red-hot poker inserted into his rectum, a method chosen to leave no external marks on the body. It was a brutal, humiliating death, fitting for a king whose reign had been defined by failure. Robert Bruce, by contrast, lived long enough to see his victory consolidated. In 1328, 14 years after Bannockburn, the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton was signed between Scotland and England. The treaty, brokered by the new English king, Edward III, who was still a teenager and under the influence of his mother and Mortimer, formally recognized Scottish independence. England renounced all claims to overlordship of Scotland. Robert Bruce was acknowledged as the legitimate King of Scots. The Stone of Destiny was supposed to be returned as part of the treaty, but it was not. It would remain in Westminster Abbey for another 690 years until 1996, when it was finally returned to Scotland. Bruce died the following year, in 1329, at the age of 54. The cause of death is uncertain, but contemporary accounts suggest he suffered from leprosy, though some modern historians believe he may have had a different chronic illness, possibly scleroderma or tuberculosis. He was buried at Dunfermline Abbey, the traditional resting place of Scottish kings. His heart was removed, as was customary for royalty, and entrusted to Sir James Douglas, who intended to carry it on crusade to the Holy Land. Douglas travelled to Spain, where he joined a campaign against the Moors. He was killed in battle near Granada, and Bruce's heart was recovered from his body and returned to Scotland, where it was interred at Melrose Abbey. As you linger in this moment, as the story settles around you like mist, as your breathing slows and deepens, consider the strangeness of what happened at Bannockburn. A king who had once hidden in caves, watching a spider spin its web, stood against the largest army England had ever sent north and broke it. The legend of the spider is probably apocryphal, but it captures something true about Bruce's journey. After his defeats in 1306, after watching his family imprisoned and his brothers executed, after months of hiding and running, Robert Bruce returned and fought with a patience and cunning that transformed him from a fugitive into a king. Bannockburn was not just about numbers, it was about tactics, terrain, discipline, and morale. Bruce chose ground that negated the English advantage in cavalry. He prepared hidden obstacles that disrupted English charges. He trained his men to fight in tight formations that could withstand cavalry assaults and even advance against them. He timed his attack perfectly, launching his assault at dawn when the English were disorganized and demoralized. And most importantly, he inspired his men to believe they could win. When he killed Henry de Bohun in single combat, he proved that courage and skill could overcome armor and horses. That single act of audacity galvanized the Scottish army in a way that no amount of gold or promises could have achieved. The consequences of Bannockburn rippled across Europe. England's reputation for military invincibility was shattered. For decades, English armies had been unstoppable, conquering Wales, hammering Scotland, dominating campaigns in France. After Bannockburn, that aura was gone. Other nations looked at what Bruce had done and learned from it. The battle demonstrated that infantry, properly trained and positioned, could defeat heavy cavalry, a lesson that would be repeated at battles like Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. The age of the mounted knight, though it would linger for another century, was beginning its long decline. Bannockburn also demonstrated the limitations of feudal armies. Edward's army, though large, lacked unity. The knights and barons who served in it were semi-independent, each commanding their own retinue, each with their own pride and interests. They did not coordinate effectively. They did not trust each other. They did not trust their king. Bruce's army, by contrast, was unified by a shared sense of purpose. The men fought not just because they were ordered to, but because they believed in the cause. That belief made them willing to endure hardships that would have broken a mercenary force. But Bannockburn was not a clean victory. War never is. The battle was followed by massacres as Scottish civilians fell upon fleeing English soldiers. Prisoners were taken and held for ransom, a medieval practice that was essentially kidnapping for profit. The war itself continued for years after Bannockburn, with raids and counter-raids leaving a trail of burned villages and devastated farmland across the border regions. The cost in human suffering was immense, and it was paid by civilians on both sides. Robert Bruce himself was a man of contradictions. He was a devout Christian who murdered a rival in a church. He was a chivalrous knight who waged brutal guerrilla war. He was a liberator who executed Scottish nobles who opposed him. He was a king who had once been a fugitive. He was a hero to the Scots and a traitor to the English. He was, in short, a human being, shaped by his time and circumstances, trying to navigate a world where power was synonymous with violence and where mercy was often a luxury no one could afford. As the night deepens, as you breathe slowly and your thoughts drift, consider the battlefield as it is today. The site of Bannockburn is now managed by the National Trust for Scotland. There is a modern visitor centre with interactive exhibits, reenactments, and educational displays. There is a statue of Robert Bruce, cast in bronze, mounted on a horse, his axe raised in eternal triumph. Tourists take photographs. Children run across the grass. The Bannockburn stream still flows through the valley, though it has been channeled and domesticated by centuries of agriculture and engineering. The exact location of the battle is uncertain, debated by historians who pore over medieval chronicles and survey maps, trying to pinpoint where the schiltron stood, where the hidden pits were dug, where the English army broke and fled. The battlefield itself has been ploughed and replanted countless times. The bodies of the dead, buried in mass graves or left to rot in the open, have long since returned to the soil. The weapons and armor, either carried away as spoils or rusted into fragments, have disappeared. The shouts and screams, the clash of steel, the thunder of hooves, all of it has faded into silence. What remains is memory, preserved in chronicles written by monks who were not present, embroidered by poets who wanted to inspire rather than inform, simplified into narratives that fit the needs of the present. In Scotland, Bannockburn is more than a battle. It is a symbol, a founding myth, a moment when the nation defined itself in opposition to English domination. It is celebrated in songs and poems, most famously in Robert Burns's Scots Wha Hae, which imagines Bruce addressing his troops before the battle. It is taught in schools, commemorated in monuments, referenced in political speeches. It is part of the story Scotland tells itself about who it is and what it stands for. But like all national myths, it is selective. It emphasizes courage and unity while downplaying the messy realities of medieval warfare. It celebrates Bruce while ignoring the many Scots who opposed him. It glorifies independence while forgetting the cost in human lives. And yet, as you rest tonight, as the story fades into the background, remember that history is never as simple as the monuments suggest. The heroes were flawed, the villains were human. The victory was messy, bought with blood and mud and luck. Robert Bruce was not a perfect man. Edward II was not a monster. They were both products of their time, trying to navigate a world where kingship was synonymous with violence, where loyalty was purchased with land and gold, where betrayal was common and mercy rare. The Battle of Bannockburn matters not because it was noble, but because it was decisive. It changed the course of history in ways that are still visible today. Without Bannockburn, Scotland might have remained an English possession, absorbed into a unified Britain centuries earlier. The Scottish Reformation, the Scottish Enlightenment, the cultural and intellectual contributions of Scotland to the world, the philosophers and engineers and scientists and writers who shaped modernity, all of these might have unfolded differently, or not at all. Bannockburn preserved Scotland's identity at a moment when that identity was in danger of being erased. But the battle also reveals a darker truth about history. Nations are forged in violence. Independence is won not through negotiation or diplomacy alone, but through the willingness to kill and die. Bruce understood this. He did not hesitate to use terror when necessary, burning villages, executing prisoners, crushing internal dissent. The cost of Scottish independence was paid not just by the English soldiers who died at Bannockburn, but by the Scots who opposed Bruce, the families torn apart by civil war, the lands devastated by scorched earth tactics. Victory is never clean. It is always built on the bones of the forgotten. So as you drift towards sleep, as this strange and quietly unbelievable story settles into your mind, hold these contradictions gently. Bruce was both a hero and a killer. Bannockburn was both a miracle and a slaughter. Scotland won its freedom, but freedom is never truly won. It must be defended, generation after generation, against new threats and old enemies. The victory at Bannockburn did not end the story. It simply turned the page. And in the end, perhaps that is the lesson of Bannockburn. That history is not made by perfect people or inevitable forces, but by human beings making choices in impossible situations. Bruce chose to stand at Bannockburn when he could have fled. His soldiers chose to hold the line when they could have broken. Edward chose to attack when he could have retreated. Each choice rippled outward, creating consequences that no one could have predicted. The hidden pits that broke the English cavalry were not destiny. They were deliberate acts of preparation. The schiltrons that advanced against overwhelming odds were not fate. They were the result of discipline and training. History is not written by the gods. It is written by people with axes and spears and desperate courage. So tonight, as you rest, as the calm darkness settles around you, you might remember that history is not only made of empires and battles, but of strange little moments. A king killing a knight with a single blow, a spider spinning a web in a cave, a stream clogged with the bodies of men who thought themselves invincible. Quiet mysteries that still linger in the dark corners of time, waiting to be remembered. And you might also remember that the world you live in was shaped by moments like these, by decisions made in fear and hope, by ordinary people standing together against impossible odds. If you enjoy drifting through these quiet stories of history, you're welcome to like the video or subscribe for more gentle journeys through the strange and forgotten past. Thank you for listening. Rest well.